Okay guys, today we're going to continue on with lesson 8, and I promise this one will be posted online. I'm sorry I made the mistake on 1-7, but I will get through it on this one. And we're going to be talking about roots. Particularly we're going to be talking about square roots is what the first part of our lesson is going to be over. So when we talk about square roots, it is a number of one of its two equal factors. These are perfect squares, numbers that two whole numbers go into two whole positive numbers or negative numbers. But if I look at the square root of 4, what two numbers can I multiply together that are the same that equal 4? Well, the square root of 4 is 2 times 2, so the square root of 4 is 2, because I can take a positive 2 and a positive 2 times each other to get the square root of 4. If I have this sign, that means I want what two negative numbers that are identical can I multiply together to get 4? And the answer is a negative 2 times a negative 2. So the negative square root of 4 is a negative 2. So the square root just means that we unsquare a number. So let's talk about this box right here. This is kind of for you to fill in your own words, but we're going to talk about what it means. I think this word means, well, if we know that it's unsquaring, it's going to be the opposite of squaring, so we can go ahead and put that down. I think it means that I'm going to be doing the opposite of squaring a number. Okay? How does this word fit with other words and concepts I know? Well, we've already talked about exponents. And one of the exponents that we talked about was the squared exponent. So like if I had 2 squared, this meant squared. So it had to do with exponents that we've already talked about. Are there parts of the word that I recognize? Well, yes, the word square, hopefully you recognize. Root maybe not be connected to math in the way that we're going to be using it today, even though you may know what the word root means scientifically. Mathematically, we haven't talked about it yet. So really the only one that you can talk about mathematically is square. What makes this an important word for me to know? Well, like I said, I can undo squaring a number. So if I have a number squared, if I want to undo that, I have to take the square root of it. So it allows me to undo squared numbers. So down here it says, what is the relationship between squaring a number and finding the square root? Well, hopefully you got that from what we just talked about. In order to undo a squaring, I can square root a number. So the square root of a number undoes, I don't really like that, it reverses a squared term. So for instance, if I had x squared, in order to undo that, I want to get rid of this squared on this x, and I want just x by itself. So to undo the squared, I want to get rid of that little 2 as the exponent. I take the square root of it. All that does is gets rid of this little bitty 2 right here, and I'm just left with an x. Okay? So in order to get rid of the 2, or the squared of a term, I take the square root of it. This sign is also called a radical sign. So I can take radical x squared, and that takes away the squared part, and I'm left with just an x. So let's look at this example down here. We're talking about a pyramid. And it says the square base, so I know that I'm dealing with a base on a pyramid that's a square, so it looks roughly like that. That's a horrible square. I'm not sure what this little chunk over here in the corner is out of for. But the square base of a pyramid is 562,500. And hopefully you know that to get the base, you take length times width. And if it's a square, then it's going to be the same number. So my length and my width are going to be the same. So essentially I've taken my length and squared it. So now if I want to just find one length, in order to unsquare this number, hopefully you remember that the square root undoes that. So to find that, I want to take the square root of 562,500. Because remember, these two side lengths are the same. So it's the same as saying I have the length squared, because I have length times length, because they're both the same number. So if I have length times length, I end up with my length squared, which gave me this number. So in order to do the squared, undo the squared, I have to take the square root of it. So that is how I would find what the side length of that triangle is. It doesn't ask us to solve, it just asks us how would you do that. All right, let's go on to page 72. And here's when we start talking about what a square root is. It's the square root of a number is one of its two equal factors. So for instance, 5 squared, if I take 5 times 5, because that's what 5 squared means to do, 5 times 5 is 25. So therefore, the square root of 25 is 5, because that is the factor that when I multiply it times itself, I get 25. Again, down here it talks about the radical sign. We've already said that. This sign right here is your radical sign. And remember that your square root can be both positive and negative, because I can take a negative 5 times a negative 5, and hopefully you remember that a negative times a negative is a positive. So I can take a negative 5 times negative 5 and get a positive 25, or I can take a positive 5 times a positive 25 and get a 25. So my square root can be either positive or negative. If there's no sign in front of the radical, then your answer is positive. Okay? If there's a negative in front of your radical sign, like on this one, then your answer is negative. If there's a positive and negative sign in front of your radical, then they want both answers. Okay? So let's look at number 1. Well, number 1 wants us to find the square root. And for this one, on 64, well, I have to think, what two numbers that are identical when multiplied together give me 64? Well, I know that 1 times 1, if I go through the entire multiplication chart, 4 times 4 is 16, 5 times 5 is 25, 6 times 6 is 36, 7 times 7 is 49, 8 times 8 is 64. So therefore, the square root of 64 is 8. Also, on your calculator, if you have a calculator, hopefully it does square roots. And this is how I would do that. On your calculator, you would type in the square root sign. And some of you have it just like this. Some of you have to hit the shift key and then the radical sign. But either way, you should have a calculator that does the square root. So you want to hit the square root sign, which I just hit this one right here. I don't know if you can see that very well. Yeah, there we go. So I hit the square root sign, which is right here. And then if I type in my number, in this case it was a 64, the square root of 64, hopefully you can see that my answer is an 8. Okay? This next one is a little bit more difficult because it is not a perfect square. I want to take the square root of 1.21. So again, on your calculator, you can do the square root sign and then do 1.21 and equal. And it's a positive, or it's 1.1. Now notice on the example, it wants the positive and the negative answer. So my answer is both the positive 1.1 and the negative 1.1. Okay? So now let's look at this next one. I want to do the square root, the negative square root, because it has a negative sign in front of it. I want the negative numbers that when multiplied together give me 25/36. Well, I can do this one of two ways. I can either do it on my calculator, which I've already showed you how to do, or you can just say, what is the square root of 25? What two numbers multiplied together give me 25? Well, the answer is 5. And then what two numbers when multiplied together give me 36? And the answer is 6. And because it has this negative out here, my answer is negative. So on this problem, my answer is a negative 5/6, which is what they do right here. Okay? On number 4, it's tricky. It tries to confuse you because it takes the negative, or the radical of negative 16. What two numbers can I multiply together to get a negative 16? Well, I can take a 4 and a negative 4. And yes, the 4's are the same, but one's positive and one's negative, so they are not identical. If they are not identical factors, then they cannot be the square root of the number. They have to be identical, meaning they both have to be positive or they both have to be negative. Because I can't take two numbers times each other and get a negative 16, because I have to have a positive times a negative to get a negative, there is no square root to this number, and you can use this as your answer, which means an empty set sign. Go ahead and try A through D on your own. We will be checking this to give you your homework tomorrow, so make sure that you do A through D on your own. Okay? And we're going to check that whenever we see your homework tomorrow. Okay, let's go on down to this next example. This next example is I want to find if t squared is this number, how do I find what just t is? So that means I want to unsquare t squared. And in order to undo a square root, in order to undo a squared number, I have to take the square root of it. So I'm going to take the square root of this t squared and the square root of 169. When I take the square root of anything squared, it gives me just the t. And then 169, the square root of 169 is a positive 13 and a negative 13. So let's look at E. E says I have an a squared, and a squared equals this number. In order to get a by itself, I have to take the radical of a squared, and whatever I do to this side of the equation, I have to do to this side. So because I took the radical here, I have to take the radical over here of 289. When I take the radical of a squared, that just takes the squared off of it, and I'm left with an a. In order to do the radical of 289, again, if you don't know this in your head, that's okay. Go ahead and use your calculator, hit your radical sign, and then 289 equals, and the answer is 17. So your answer is not just a positive 17, but remember there's two answers to every radical, so it's a positive 17 and a negative 17. So this is positive 17 and negative 17, and I can write it just like that. Hopefully you can see my 1 right there. So for E, it's a positive negative 17, because 17 times 17 is 289, negative 17 times negative 17 is 289. Now let's do this one. M squared equals 0.09. I want to take the radical of m squared because I want to get rid of that squared, and I'm going to take the radical of 0.09. The radical of anything squared is just that term, so I'm left with an m over here. The radical of 0.09 is a 0.03. And again, it's positive and negative. If you don't believe me, go to your calculator, type in the radical sign, 0.09 equals, oops, Mrs. Neely was wrong, 0.3. Okay? So it's positive and negative 0.3. So for F, M equals positive negative 0.3. Okay? Now on this next one, again, I want to take the radical of y squared because I want to get rid of that. I'm going to take the radical of 4/25. The radical of y squared is just y. The square root of 4 is 2. The square root of 5 is 5. So y equals 2/5. Okay guys, that's where we're going to stop for this 1.8. This is 1.8 part 1. We will continue with 1.8 tomorrow, talking about cube roots. So be prepared to watch the 1.8 part 2 tomorrow. But for today, that's all we're going to do. Have a great night. We'll see you guys tomorrow.